Welcome to the History Maps podcast. In the winter of 1876, the United States government issued an ultimatum to nomadic families living out on the Great Plains.
Right, and the terms of that ultimatum were incredibly harsh.
Basically, they were told to travel hundreds of miles through deep snow to a government reservation by January 31st, or, well, they'd be considered hostile combatants.
Which, it wasn't a request designed for actual compliance.
No, not at all. It was a calculated, a manufactured justification for one of the most consequential conflicts in American history.
Absolutely.
So in this deep dive, we are exploring the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877.
And this was a really complex, multifaceted conflict,
Yeah.
It featured an alliance of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne facing off against the United States.
Over a highly coveted expanse of geography known as the Black Hills. We are going to dissect the political and economic causes that led to the violence, examine the specific military strategies on both sides, and unpack the legislative and diplomatic maneuvers that ultimately broke the indigenous resistance on the northern Great Plains.
Because the time frame of 1876 is critical. It forces us to look past the standard mythology of the American West, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really examine the raw mechanics of 19th century geopolitics.
Yeah, the collision we see here involves legal treaties intersecting with severe economic desperation.
Exactly. Followed by a profound shift from conventional military strategy to basically environmental and economic warfare.
Great, but to understand the stakes, we first have to establish what the northern Great Plains looked like before the U.S. cavalry even arrived in force.
Because the power dynamics of the indigenous tribes were, they were already in a state of rapid transformation.
Yeah, looking at the historical migration patterns in the sources, it is a completely fluid map. The Cheyenne actually migrated west to the Black Hills and the Powder River country well before the Lakota arrived.
You did, yeah.
Then, right around 1730, a technological shift altered everything.
The horse.
Exactly. The Cheyenne introduced the Lakota to horse culture.
And when you introduce the horse to a pedestrian society on the plains, you are fundamentally rewriting their economy,
Right.
and their military capability.
It entirely restructures their society.
Yeah, before the horse, plains tribes relied on dogs for transport, utilizing the travois.
Right.
And hunting buffalo on foot was dangerous and, frankly, yielded limited results.
Yeah.
But the horse provided this profound leap in mobility and efficiency.
A mounted hunter could single out a buffalo, make a precise kill, and the tribe could transport significantly more meat.
Larger lodge poles for bigger tippies, greater material wealth, all of it.
So by the late 18th century, this newly adopted horse culture transformed the Lakota into a highly mobile society, pushing aggressively west of the Missouri River.
And as they expand, they run into other established nations.
Right, they push out the Kiowa and form a very strategic, long-lasting alliance with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho.
Which basically establishes regional hegemony over the richest buffalo hunting grounds on the northern plains.
But they are taking that territory from other tribes. They fought a pretty protracted war against the Crow and the Shoshone to control that geography.
And we have to keep that intertribal context in mind because it dictates the alliances of the 1870s. Most of the battlefields where the U.S. Army fought the Lakota and Cheyenne were located on lands those tribes had conquered from other indigenous nations over the previous decades.
The Crow, for instance, had treaties with the United States acknowledging their claim to some of those exact areas.
Right. In fact, by 1873, a prominent Crow chief named Blackfoot formally requested U.S. military intervention against the Lakota.
He actually categorized them as hostile intruders on Crow land, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Which clarifies why the Crow and the Arikara allied with the United States military during the Great Sioux War.
They weren't just working as mercenaries.
No, not at all. They were leveraging a heavily armed external military force to strike back at a rival coalition that had been pushing them out of their ancestral territories for a generation.
That makes a lot of sense. But the overarching legal framework that defined this entire conflict was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868.
Yes, the document that concluded Red Cloud's War.
Right, signed by Lakota and Northern Cheyenne leaders and the U.S. government. What did that actually stipulate?
Well, the text of the 1868 treaty is highly specific regarding geography and usage rights. It established the Great Sioux Reservation, which encompassed the entire western half of what is now South Dakota.
And importantly, that included the Black Hills.
Exactly. And beyond that, it designated a vast tract of land in Wyoming and Montana the Powder River country, as unceded territory.
And the legal definition of unceded territory essentially meant the United States recognized it as an exclusive hunting ground for the Cheyenne and Lakota, right?
Yes. The treaty explicitly forbade white settlement or trespass in both the reservation and the unceded territory.
The only non-Indigenous people legally allowed across that border were specific U.S. government officials.
Which brings us to the economic value of the Black Hills for the Lakota.
Because it wasn't just empty land.
No, it was a vital survival engine. The plains offer a harsh environment, and the Black Hills provided a sheltered microclimate.
Right. They contained straight pines necessary for lodge poles, specific medicinal and edible plants, and an abundance of small game.
Game that sustained the tribes during harsh winters or when the buffalo herds shifted their migration routes.
Years later, when a U.S. commission visited the Red Cloud Agency, Colonel John E. Smith observed the economic reliance the Lakota had on the area.
He reported that the Black Hills were the only portion of their reservation with tangible value to them.
He even concluded that the tribes would never relinquish the territory short of total annihilation.
It's kind of like an analogy I often think of. The 1868 treaty was like a locked door with a glass window.
Oh, how so?
The U.S. government and its citizens could see the resources inside, but the law said they couldn't touch them.
Until pressure from the outside shattered the glass.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The tension arises because a legal document is only as strong as the political will to enforce it.
Right.
When external economic pressures reach a certain threshold, a government will inevitably search for a way to break its own laws.
And the catalyst that broke that political will was a combination of geology and a national financial collapse.
Because in the early 1870s, rumors of gold in the Black Hills had been circulating.
So to investigate, the government dispatched General George Armstrong Custer in 1874.
To lead an expedition directly into the heart of the Lakota territory.
And obviously, the Lakota view a heavily armed cavalry column marching through their sacred and economically vital territory as a direct violation of the treaty.
Which it absolutely was.
But Custer's expedition finds exactly what they were looking for. They find gold.
And Custer being Custer, he doesn't keep it quiet.
No, he brings a newspaper correspondent with him. The news is telegraphed to the East Coast before his column even returns to Fort Abraham Lincoln.
And then to verify the claims scientifically, the government sent the Newton-Jenny Geological Expedition the following year, in 1875.
And they confirmed it. Extractable mineral wealth.
They did.
Yeah.
But the discovery alone isn't what caused the crisis. We really have to look at the macroeconomic state of the United States at that time.
Right, because in 1873, the country had plunged into a severe economic panic.
Railroad bonds collapsed, banks failed, and unemployment just spiked dramatically.
So you have a desperate, impoverished population in the East, and suddenly newspapers are advertising a gold strike in the West.
It operates as an irresistible magnet. Motivated by that panic of 1873, individual prospectors and highly organized mining companies begin illegally crossing into the Black Hills.
The initial response from the U.S. Army was actually an attempt to uphold the treaty, right?
It was. In December 1874, a large group of miners known as the Gordon Party traveled from Sioux City, Iowa. They bypassed Army patrols and established a stockade in the Black Hills. It took the Army 3 months to locate them, arrest them, and escort them out of the territory.
But these enforcement actions proved entirely futile.
Completely. The logistics of border enforcement on the Great Plains made it an impossible task for the limited number of troops available.
I mean, miners were outfitting expeditions from New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The military would evict one group, and 3 more would slip past them.
And more critically, the act of using the U.S. military to forcibly evict desperate American citizens from a gold field generated severe political blowback for President Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah, that political pressure is key. Why didn't the U.S. simply deploy the entire military to keep the miners out, since that was the letter of the treaty?
Well, the political mechanics of the Grant administration shifted rapidly. The executive branch was facing enormous public outrage.
Heavily amplified by newspapers promoting Manifest Destiny.
Exactly. The government realized that continuously arresting white citizens to protect a treaty with indigenous tribes was politically toxic during an economic depression.
So the objective changed. If they could not enforce the treaty, they needed to alter the treaty to legalize the presence of the miners.
Right. They pivoted to diplomacy to rewrite the law.
So in May 1875, a major council is convened in Washington, D.C.
The government brings in highly influential Sioux leaders, including Spotted Tail, Red Cloud, and Longhorn.
And the administration's goal is to negotiate a buyout. What did they offer?
President Grant, Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delano, and Commissioner of Indian Affairs Edward Smith presented their terms. They offered a payment of $25,000 for the Black Hills.
Which is incredibly low.
And they proposed that the tribes relocate entirely to Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma.
That proposal is completely disconnected from the reality of the Lakota leadership.
Totally.
They are being asked to sell their most vital economic asset for a fraction of its value and move hundreds of miles away to a totally different ecosystem.
And Spotted Tail's response was, well, it was a masterclass in pointing out the hypocrisy of the situation.
What did he say?
He told the American officials that if Indian Territory was such a valuable and desirable place to live, the U.S. government should send the white miners down there and leave the Lakota alone in their own country.
Oh, that's brilliant.
There was a flat rejection. The leaders returned to the plains, and a subsequent government commission sent out in late 1875 to negotiate at the Indian agencies also failed to secure a new agreement.
So the diplomatic avenues for acquiring the Black Hills peacefully were officially exhausted.
They were. And furthermore, there was escalating friction regarding the proposed route of the Northern Pacific Railroad.
Right, which the U.S. intended to build directly through the unceded hunting grounds?
Yes. So the failure of the Washington meetings forces a shift in strategy. In early November 1875, President Grant convenes a meeting with General Philip Sheridan, who commands the Division of the Missouri.
And General George Crook, who commands the Department of the Platte?
Exactly. They make a quiet, executive decision to completely stop enforcing the treaty. The Army is ordered to stand down and allow the miners free access to the Black Hills.
And in that same meeting, they lay the groundwork for military action.
Right. Because an Indian inspector named Irwin C. Watkins had circulated a report advising that the government should target the non-treaty bands living out in the unceded territory.
He basically advocated for a winter campaign to whip them into subjection.
So to create the legal pretext for this campaign, the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued an order requiring all Lakota and Sioux bands to report to the reservation agencies by January 31st, 1876.
So let's ask the listener to examine the physical reality of that deadline. When you issue an ultimatum in late December, expecting nomadic families to pack up their entire winter camps, gather their herds, and travel hundreds of miles through deep snow, is it a genuine request?
Or a calculated justification for war.
Right. The U.S. agents stationed at Standing Rock Agency recognized this was a physical impossibility and formally requested an extension.
And the government explicitly denied the request. General Sheridan's internal correspondence reveals the true nature of the order. He referred to the notification process as a good joke.
A joke.
Yeah. He was fully aware that the native bands could not and would not comply.
But out in the unceded territory, the bands actually did discuss the mandate, didn't they?
Yep, they did. Short Bull, an Oglala leader, recalled a large gathering on the Tongue River where the consensus was simple. Their horses were weak, the snow was deep, and they needed to hunt buffalo to survive the winter.
So they agreed they would travel to the agencies in the spring when travel was viable.
Right. But when January 31st passed without the bands arriving, the government had the bureaucratic justification it needed.
So on February 8th, 1876, General Sheridan telegraphed Generals Crook and Terry, authorizing them to commence military operations.
But before we detail the specific campaigns, we need to understand the combatants. Who exactly is the U.S. military fighting, and what are the capabilities on both sides?
Well, looking at the demographics, they dictate the scope of the war. The total Lakota population in 1876 was approximately 15,000 individuals.
However, the vast majority of those people, roughly 10,000, were living on the Great Sioux Reservation. They were non-combatants, entirely reliant on government rations.
Right, so the war was strictly against the non-treaty bands residing out in the unceded territory.
Exactly. And the population in the unceded territory consisted mainly of Oglala and Hunkpapa Lakota, totaling about 5,500 people.
Add in approximately 1,500 Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, and the entire hostile population is around 7,000 men, women, and children.
Out of that number, General Crook estimated he would face a maximum of 2,000 capable warriors.
And those 2,000 warriors possessed distinct tactical advantages. They operated with a decentralized command structure, allowing for fluid, independent action.
And they had an intimate knowledge of the topography. They utilized ravines and ridges for ambushes and rapid evasion.
But they also had severe limitations. They were essentially a part-time militia.
Right, a warrior's primary duty was feeding and protecting his immediate family. Furthermore, their logistical mobility was entirely dependent on their pony herds.
Which were notoriously weak and undernourished during the winter and early spring months.
Right, and their armaments were incredibly varied. Some warriors carried modern repeating rifles, like the Winchester or the Henry, which they acquired through trade.
But the vast majority were armed with outdated muzzle-loading muskets or traditional bows and arrows.
Now, the short plains bow was highly effective at close range from a moving horse, but it lacked the stopping power and range necessary to engage fortified infantry.
Ammunition for the firearms was also incredibly scarce and difficult to procure for the native warriors.
Contrast that with the United States military, the structural advantages were immense, despite the individual soldiers often lacking frontier experience.
The U.S. deployed roughly 2,500 soldiers in the theater during the summer of 1876.
Supported by extensive supply wagons, pack mules, civilian contractors, and hundreds of allied Indian scouts.
Let's talk about the standard issue weapon for the U.S. cavalry during this conflict, because it's important. It was the Springfield Model, 1873.
Yes. This was a breech-loading, single-shot rifle firing a .45 caliber copper cartridge.
Because it loaded from the rear, a soldier could remain prone behind cover, pop open the trapdoor, insert a cartridge, and fire rapidly.
It had an effective range far exceeding a bow or a smoothbore musket, allowing the military to establish lethal perimeters from a distance.
However, the Springfield did have a critical flaw that would manifest during heavy engagements.
It did. The copper cartridges had a tendency to expand and jam in the breech when the barrel overheated from rapid fire.
So soldiers would have to manually pry the casing out with a knife, rendering the weapon temporarily useless during close-quarters combat.
Still, generally the logistical and technological superiority favored the U.S. Army as they launched their first strike in March of 1876.
So General Crook organizes a winter strike force. And on March 17, a detachment led by Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds locates a native village on the Powder River.
Right, and Reynolds initiates a dawn assault, operating under the assumption that he has found the encampment of the prominent Oglala War leader, Crazy Horse.
But the intelligence was fundamentally flawed. It was not Crazy Horse's village.
No, it was a predominantly Northern Cheyenne camp, led by Old Bear and Two Moons, accompanied by a small Oglala contingent under He Dog.
Reynolds' troops charged into the village and began systematically burning the lodges and destroying the winter food stores, which was, the standard tactic for winter warfare on the plains.
But the Cheyenne and Oglala warriors rally quickly. They take up defensive positions on the surrounding bluffs, and they lay down heavy covering fire.
The U.S. troops find themselves pinned down in the burning village. The command structure completely breaks down.
Colonel Reynolds orders a rapid retreat, and the withdrawal is so chaotic that the cavalry actually leaves several of their own dead and wounded soldiers behind on the battlefield.
Leaving men behind is a severe breach of military discipline.
It is. Colonel Reynolds was later court-martialed for his actions during this engagement.
And to make matters worse, while the military had successfully captured the village's pony herd during the initial assault, they failed to secure it during the retreat.
The native warriors simply followed the column and recaptured their horses the following day.
The Reynolds campaign was a complete operational failure. It proved that executing a winter campaign against an enemy intimately familiar with the terrain was highly complex and dangerous.
Right, so the military retreats, regroups, and devises a huge synchronized strategy for the summer of 1876.
They planned to send 3 separate columns converging on the unceded territory to trap the hostile bands.
The strategic concept was an anvil and hammer approach. The native bands were highly mobile. If a single column approached, they would simply pack up their tippas and scatter.
So by coordinating 3 columns, the Army hoped to pin them in place.
Right. You had the Dakota Column, under General Alfred Terry, marching west from Fort Abraham Lincoln. This force included the entire 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Custer.
Then you had the Montana Column, commanded by Colonel John Given, moving east from Fort Ellis.
And the 3rd Force, commanded by General Crook, moved north from Fort Fetterman.
It was an enormous logistical undertaking, moving infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supply trains across hundreds of miles of roadless prairie.
But the first fracture of the strategy occurred with General Crook's column.
Moving north, Crook encountered a large, unified force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors on June 17 at the Battle of the Rosebud.
And unlike previous engagements, where Native forces would engage briefly and withdraw, the warriors at the Rosebud fought a sustained, highly aggressive battle.
They repeatedly charged the cavalry lines, breaking up Crook's formations and forcing him into a defensive posture.
While Crook maintained control of the battlefield at the end of the day and technically claimed a victory, the strategic reality was entirely different.
The Native forces had effectively neutralized the southern arm of the U.S. offensive.
Yes. Following the Battle of the Rosebud, General Crook made a highly conservative decision. Rather than pressing forward to link up with Terry and Gibbon, he withdrew his column to a supply camp and waited for reinforcements.
He remained inactive for several weeks,
completely removing his forces from the board just as the summer campaign reached its climax.
which leaves Terry and Gibbon operating in the north without their southern anvil.
Right. So on June 22, General Terry orders Custer and the 7th Cavalry to detach from the main column and scout the valleys of the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn rivers.
And on the morning of June 25, Custer scouts locate an enormous encampment stretching along the west bank of the Little Bighorn.
Estimates of the village size vary, but historical consensus suggests there were between 900 and 2,000 warriors present, representing multiple bands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho.
Custer, fearing the village would scatter if they detected his presence, made the fateful decision to attack immediately without waiting for Gibbon's infantry to arrive.
And furthermore, he divides his command in the face of a numerically superior enemy.
He sends Major Marcus Reno with 3 companies to attack the southern end of the village.
He sends Captain Frederick Benteen with 3 companies to scout the ridges to the south and prevent an escape.
And Custer himself takes 5 companies and moves north along the bluffs, attempting to flank the village and strike from the opposite end.
Reno's charge into the southern end of the village was quickly met by overwhelming force.
He was forced to halt, dismount, and form a skirmish line in the timber before retreating in complete disarray back across the river to defensive positions on the bluffs,
where he was eventually joined by Benteen's column.
Meanwhile, Custer's immediate command of roughly 210 men found themselves cut off and heavily engaged by warriors led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and Lame White Man.
And the exact sequence of events regarding Custer's detachment is pieced together from native accounts and archaeological evidence.
What is certain is that the 5 companies were systematically surrounded, pushed into defensive clusters, and entirely annihilated.
Not a single U.S. soldier from Custer's immediate command survived the afternoon. It was the most severe defeat the U.S. Army suffered during the Plains Indian Wars.
The surviving forces under Reno and Benteen remained besieged on the bluffs for 2 days.
Until the arrival of General Terry and Colonel Gibbon's columns on June 27 forced the native warriors to strike their village and disperse.
So, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was a profound tactical triumph for the Lakota and Cheyenne. But strategically, it initiated their downfall.
Because the news of Custer's destruction reached the East Coast just as the United States was celebrating its centennial.
The public reaction was absolute outrage.
The political restraint that had previously checked the military was entirely removed. Congress authorized an immediate expansion of the Army.
And the strategic doctrine shifted definitively from seeking pitched battles to conducting total war against the indigenous population's means of survival.
The military realized that chasing highly mobile warriors on horseback during the summer was inefficient.
Right.
The new objective was to relentlessly pursue the bands, force them to keep moving, and systematically destroy their infrastructure.
Their lodges, their winter clothing, their food reserves, and their pony herds.
This shift to a war of attrition becomes evident in late summer.
General Crook, having finally received reinforcements, begins moving again. But the logistics of supplying thousands of men in the field break down completely.
By early September, Crook's column is marching toward the mining settlements in the Black Hills in a desperate attempt to find food.
This movement is recorded in history as the Horsemeat March. Let's bring that to life for the listener because the conditions were horrific.
They really were. The troops marched for days through torrential rain and deep mud. Their rations were completely exhausted.
To prevent mass starvation, the command ordered the soldiers to begin slaughtering and eating their own cavalry mounts and pack mules.
The physical deterioration of the men was severe, illustrating that the environment itself was an equal adversary in this conflict.
On September 9, an advanced detachment of Crook's starving column stumbled upon a small mini-Kanju village at Slim Buttes.
Desperate for the food stores inside, the cavalry attacked. They drove the inhabitants into the surrounding bluffs, looted the tipis for dried meat and supplies, and burned the rest.
Crazy Horse learned of the attack and led a counterassault the next day, but the heavily entrenched military repulsed it.
Slim Buttes was a minor skirmish in terms of casualties, but it demonstrated the new reality.
Right. The army would target the villages regardless of the season or the conditions.
However, while the military ground down the hostile bands in the field, the United States Congress enacted a piece of legislation that was far more devastating than any military campaign.
Ah, yes. In August 1876, they passed an attachment to the Indian Appropriations Act, known as the Sell or Starve Rider.
This legislation functioned like a modern economic sanction, utilizing the bureaucratic machinery of the state to enforce compliance.
The rider mandated that the government would cease all distribution of rations to the Sioux living on the reservations until they officially agreed to cede the Black Hills and the Powder River country to the United States.
It was the weaponization of starvation. By 1876, the reservation bands were almost entirely dependent on government rations.
Because the buffalo herds in the region were rapidly declining due to commercial hunting.
And the reservation boundaries severely restricted their ability to sustain themselves independently.
Congress essentially held the non-combatant population, the women, children, and elders at the agencies hostage, to force the surrender of the war leaders in the unceded territory.
And the military enforced this crackdown at the agency level. They flooded the reservations with troops.
In October, General Crook ordered the encirclement of the villages of Red Cloud and Red Leaf.
They arrested the leaders, citing their failure to report individuals arriving from the hostile bands. But the primary objective of this action was logistical.
The military systematically confiscated thousands of horses and firearms from the friendly bands residing at the agencies.
Because the Army's intelligence correctly indicated that the reservations were operating as supply depots for the resistance.
Ammunition, fresh horses, and intelligence were flowing from the agencies out to the Powder River country.
So by dismounting and disarming the agency population, the U.S. Army severed the critical supply lines that sustained the non-treaty bands.
This legislative pressure campaign culminated in Congress passing a subsequent law that formally extinguished all Lakota rights to the unceded territory in the Black Hills.
Which brings up a major point. We need to examine the legality of this action.
Right, because the Fort Laramie Treaty was a binding international agreement ratified by the U.S. Senate. How does a domestic legislative body legally abrogate an established treaty without the consent of the other party?
Well, the mechanism relies on a legal doctrine known as plenary power. In the context of 19th century U.S. law, the Supreme Court repeatedly affirmed that Congress held absolute plenary authority over Native American affairs.
So if Congress passed a statute that directly conflicted with a prior treaty, the courts ruled that the subsequent statute became the supreme law of the land.
Exactly. It allowed the government to legally rewrite its obligations without requiring bilateral negotiation. The treaty was erased by a bureaucratic decree.
With the economic and legal nets pulling tight, the military resumed its winter offensives. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie and the 4th Cavalry entered the field.
On November 25, 1876, Mackenzie's Indian Scouts located an enormous northern Cheyenne village hidden in a canyon in the Bighorn Mountains.
This engagement is known as the Dull Knife Fight.
Mackenzie executed a dawn assault, driving the Cheyenne out of the village and up into the freezing, exposed bluffs.
But rather than pursuing them into the rocks, Mackenzie's troops spent the entire day methodically destroying the village.
They burned over 200 lodges, incinerated thousands of buffalo robes necessary for winter survival, destroyed all the stored winter meat, and captured the entire pony herd.
And the temperature that night dropped below zero.
The Cheyenne, including women and children, were trapped in the bluffs with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Several infants froze to death before morning.
The survivors were forced to march for over a week through the snow to find shelter in the camps of Crazy Horse.
By prioritizing the destruction of shelter and food in sub-zero temperatures, the military utilized the environment to inflict a level of devastation that bullets could not achieve.
History often fixates on Little Bighorn, but it was actually the destruction of supplies in the dead of winter that decided the war.
It absolutely was. That tactic broke the ability of the Northern Cheyenne to continue the war.
Concurrently, Colonel Nelson A. Miles established a permanent military installation, the Tongue River Cantonment, deep inside the unceded territory.
Operating throughout the winter, Miles' infantry, outfitted in heavy winter gear, relentlessly pursued the remaining bands.
In January 1877, Miles engaged Crazy Horse's warriors at the Battle of Wolf Mountain.
It was a chaotic, blizzard-swept engagement. The artillery fire and the constant pressure prevented the native bands from resting or hunting.
The continuous winter campaigning by Miles created a state of perpetual exhaustion among the Lakota and Cheyenne. Their horses were dying, their ammunition was depleted, and starvation was setting in.
Following the Dull Knife fight, the Northern Cheyenne realized resistance was futile and began surrendering at the agencies in the spring of 1877.
The U.S. government, intent on clearing the northern plains, forced the Cheyenne to relocate to the Darlington Agency in Indian Territory, Oklahoma.
Placing them alongside the Southern Cheyenne.
But the conditions in Oklahoma were a death sentence for the northern tribe. They were accustomed to the high plains. In Oklahoma, they faced rampant malaria, severe heat, and woefully inadequate government rations.
And the buffalo were completely gone from the region.
After enduring a year of starvation and disease, a faction of the Northern Cheyenne decided they would rather die fighting on the plains than waste away in Indian Territory.
So in September 1877, Chiefs Little Wolf and Dull Knife led an exodus of roughly 300 Cheyenne, including women and children.
Breaking out of the reservation and trekking hundreds of miles north, evading thousands of pursuing U.S. troops.
The band eventually split. Little Wolf's faction successfully reached the sandhills of Nebraska and remained hidden for months.
Dull Knife's band, however, was captured and imprisoned at Fort Robinson in Nebraska.
The commanding officer at Fort Robinson received orders to force Dull Knife's people back to Oklahoma.
And when they categorically refused, the military locked them inside a wooden barracks in the middle of January without any heating, fuel, food, or water.
For several days, the Cheyenne endured freezing temperatures inside the prison.
On the night of January 9, 1878, driven to absolute desperation, the Cheyenne executed a breakout.
They reassembled a few hidden weapons, broke the windows, and fled into the snow.
The U.S. troops pursued them immediately, initiating a running firefight in the darkness. Over the next several days, the military hunted down the escapees.
Most of Dull Knife's band, including women and children, were killed in what is recorded as the Fort Robinson Massacre.
The tragedy ultimately forced the government to relent and establish a permanent reservation for the Northern Cheyenne in Montana.
Returning to the winter of 1876, while the military is destroying villages and enforcing starvation, the government is also running a parallel campaign of diplomacy.
But this wasn't traditional diplomacy. They were utilizing native emissaries to carry the message of surrender to the exhausted bands in the Powder River country.
Right. The military recognized that an armed cavalry column approaching a village would simply trigger a battle or a flight response.
So by sending trusted, influential native leaders, the U.S. could negotiate a capitulation without further expenditure of military resources.
In January 1877, a delegation of young men, including an Oglala named Enemy Bate, later known as George Sword, rode out from Camp Robinson.
They locate Crazy Horse's camp, but he refuses to meet with them.
However, other prominent leaders in the surrounding camps are willing to listen. The harsh winter and the constant military pressure have altered the calculus.
In February, the highly respected Brule leader, Spotted Tail, leaves his agency with a large delegation of 200 people to conduct direct negotiations.
Spotted Tail held immense cultural authority. He traveled to the camps of the Miniconjou leader Touch the Clouds, and after several days of intensive counsel, secured their agreement to surrender.
Spotted Tail's delegation continued across the frozen plains, meeting with various factions. While he did not speak with Crazy Horse directly, a critical diplomatic exchange occurred.
Yes. Crazy Horse's father presented a horse to a member of Spotted Tail's party.
And in the complex language of plains diplomacy, gifting a horse to a peace delegation was not a random act of generosity.
No, it was a tangible, recognized signal that the war leader was finally preparing to lay down his arms.
Concurrently, Colonel Miles sends out his own emissary, a scout named Johnny Bruyere, who successfully negotiates the surrender of a large Cheyenne encampment.
The final diplomatic push occurred in April, when the legendary Oglala leader Red Cloud led a delegation to formally escort Crazy Horse's people back to the agency.
The use of Red Cloud and Spotted Tail was a highly effective strategy. They represented the reality of the reservation system.
They could offer the non-treaty bands a guarantee of survival and rations, providing a culturally acceptable off-ramp from a war that was no longer winnable.
It's like this diplomacy wasn't a negotiation at a table. It was a slow tightening of a net, where the emissaries were just offering the final exit before the net closed.
Exactly. And by May 5, 1877, the resistance effectively collapsed when Crazy Horse, accompanied by hundreds of his followers, rode into the Red Cloud Agency and formally surrendered.
The Great Sioux War, as a unified military conflict, was over, but the surrender initiated a tense and tragic aftermath for the leaders involved.
Because Crazy Horse's presence at the agency created intense friction.
The military remained deeply suspicious of his intentions, fearing he was planning to break out and resume fighting.
False rumors, exacerbated by translation errors during councils, convinced the commanding officers that Crazy Horse needed to be arrested and removed from the region entirely.
So on September 4, the military moves to apprehend him. He briefly evades capture and rides to the Spotted Tail Agency, seeking the protection of his uncle, Spotted Tail.
But the following day, he is persuaded to return to Camp Robinson under the explicit promise that he will be allowed to explain his position to the post commander.
The promise was a deception. Upon arriving at Camp Robinson, he was not taken to the commander's office. Instead, he was escorted toward the guardhouse.
When Crazy Horse saw the iron bars and realized he was being imprisoned, he immediately drew a hidden knife and struggled to free himself from the guards.
In the ensuing chaos, a soldier acting as a guard fatally bayoneted him in the abdomen. He died later that night.
The death of Crazy Horse removed the primary symbol of Oglala resistance. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa leader who had been a guiding spiritual force during the war, took a completely different trajectory.
Refusing to surrender to the United States, he led his followers north and crossed the border into Canada, seeking refuge under the jurisdiction of the British Crown.
The U.S. government was highly anxious about a large, hostile force residing just across a porous border.
General Terry traveled to Canada to negotiate with Sitting Bull, offering a full pardon if he would return to the reservation.
Sitting Bull flatly rejected the offer, choosing to remain in exile. It wasn't until 1881, facing severe starvation as the Canadian buffalo herds vanished, that Sitting Bull finally surrendered at Fort Beaufort.
Largely through the mediation of a trader named Jean-Louis Legare.
With the leadership either dead, imprisoned, or in exile, the United States finalized the acquisition of the contested territory.
The Agreement of 1877 formally stripped the Black Hills and the Powder River country from the Sioux, shrinking the Great Sioux Reservation and cementing the legal dispossession that the war had accomplished militarily.
When analyzing the broader implications of the Great Sioux War, we have to look at the internal demographics of the Lakota.
Unlike Red Cloud's War in the 1860s, where the tribes fought with a relatively unified purpose, the War of 1876 revealed deep fractures.
Two-thirds of the Lakota population remained at the agencies throughout the conflict, dependent on government rations and declining to participate in the fighting.
That political division between the agency bands and the non-treaty bands carried forward into the subsequent decades of the reservation era.
It is a critical piece of context for understanding the tragedy of 1890. When the Ghost Dance movement swept across the reservations, offering a spiritual revival and a return to the old ways, the vast majority of its ardent followers were drawn directly from the ranks of those exact same non-agency bands who had fought and surrendered in 1877.
Furthermore, analyzing the raw data of the conflict challenges the traditional narrative focus.
Historically, the war is titled the Great Sioux War, reflecting the numerical superiority of the Lakota. However, military records indicate that the Northern Cheyenne suffered a disproportionate amount of the violence.
Given that the Cheyenne were highly centralized and suffered the most camp destructions, should this conflict actually be remembered as the Great Cheyenne War?
Some modern analyses suggest it could accurately be reframed that way. Because their society was more centralized than the fluid Lakota bands, the loss of a single village was catastrophic to their overall structure.
The deeper we dive into the mechanics of this period, the clearer the reality becomes. This was not a war of random skirmishes.
It was a methodical process of dispossession, driven by national economic pressures.
The United States government, facing a financial panic and a public demanding access to mineral wealth, chose to actively dismantle a ratified treaty.
When military force alone could not solve the problem, they weaponized the harsh environment and enforced starvation to break the political will of the indigenous nations.
It is a stark illustration of the limits of legal agreements when confronted by aggressive economic expansion.
The use of plenary power to overwrite international treaties, combined with the strategy of total war against civilian infrastructure, defined the conclusion of the Plains Indian Wars and permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of the American West.
Which leaves us with a final concept to consider. The entire war was precipitated by the discovery of gold within a legally protected territory. What if the political dynamics in Washington had been different? If the United States government had possessed the political fortitude to withstand the public outcry, aggressively deploy the military to keep the miners out, and strictly honor the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, how would the map of North America look today? Would a sovereign, legally recognized, resource-rich Native American nation exist in the absolute center of the continent? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.